Hi, thank you very much, Adrian. So I will keep my video off just to help with the bandwidth. Um, Great, yeah. So thank you very much for all the speakers for setting the scene and getting us here. I think what we're going to try and do in this session is trying to make all of this a little bit more practical. So we've talked a lot about the TCFD, about what it's trying to achieve, and now it's time to kind of dig into the detail and see exactly how that's done in practice. That last polling question was interesting. It was interesting that people were split down the middle, because I think as we'll show you now in this session, the TCFD, it really expects the investors to do similar disclosure. So investors and asset managers are not off the hook. Of course, they require the information from the companies, but as you'll see now, it's they also expected to be reporting. Okay, so you by now you'll be well familiar with the four pillars. And really the metrics and targets is really the element that kind of concretizes the other four or the other three. So according to the TCFD guidance, it's required to disclose metrics and targets, used to assess and manage relevant climate-related risks and opportunities where such information is material. So I think so immediately the important thing to measure there is it's not just about disclosure. The metrics that you disclose and that you expect companies to disclose are the ones that they would be using to manage risks and opportunities. So the choice of metrics is very important, because that's basically how a company or an asset manager signals to its stakeholders that it's tracking the right information and that it has the information it needs in order to manage risks and opportunities. So where there's general, the 11 sub points that Sarah talked you through earlier, of course, provides general guidance to all users of the TCFD. There's also specific guidance for asset owners, and those are the ones that we're going to be digging in a little bit as we go along. So firstly, the general metrics and targets, like I say, is to disclose the ones you use to manage risk and opportunities. It's also then, important to disclose Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions, and really the important way to decide which emissions to disclose is, again, as it relates to risks. So in most cases, the focus have been in Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, but I think there's growing understanding that Scope 3 emissions, so value chain emissions, do also link to risks, and they do create risks and opportunities that need to be managed. And more organizations are starting to focus on also disclosing their Scope 3 emissions. And of course, from the perspective of an asset manager, or most financial sector companies for that matter, the finance Scope 3 emissions, so your portfolio emissions, is classified under the Greenhouse Gas Protocol as financed Scope 3 emissions, is really where most of the vulnerability and most of the opportunities lie. So you'll see a general move towards more Scope 3 emissions over time, and we'll show you some examples later on. But then also the important thing is, the metrics are important, but so are targets, because targets signal intent and they signal planning. So whereas the metrics are obviously critical in order for measuring risks, targets provide information about what companies are planning to do and institutions are planning to do. So they help you get a forward-looking indication of whether people are taking climate change seriously, and whether they are in a position in order to really influence their own trajectories, but also manage the risks and opportunities. So before we go on, just to get the terminology right. So the basis of everything is the metrics. So climate-related metrics is a quantitative indicative of the level of historical, current, and forward-looking climate-related risks and opportunities for a given organization. So again, these metrics, they don't just have to be emissions. They can be anything. They can be risks related to emissions. They can be markets that you serve, products. The users of products. They can be customer preferences. The list is infinite. But the important thing is that they they are used to track climate-related risks and opportunities, and metrics can be used to measure progress over time, um, and that's really the key point. So even though there are some metrics suggested in the TCFD, it really is an organization specific decision, and it's something that you should think a little bit about, as you go as you go down this journey. Now, in terms of climate-related impact, or climate-related financial impact, that is really the historical or current quantity of forward-looking or forward-looking quantitative outlook. So based on estimates, projections, or forecasts, of how are these metrics going to be translated into financial impacts, and be that opportunities or be that risks. So, I mean, a classic example would be a metric would be greenhouse gas emissions. The financial impact would be if those emissions are subject to a carbon price, for example, then the carbon price times the metric emissions would give you the climate-related financial impacts. Obviously, that's a simple example, because you would also get climate-related financial impacts through market changes, so through changes in demand for products and so forth. So any climate-related issue that impacts financial flows, impacts revenues, impact costs. These are all climate-related financial impacts. And then, of course, the target at the end. The target is a specific level, threshold, or a quantity of a metric that the organization wishes to meet over a defined time horizon, and that will signal that the organization, that signals the organization's overall climate-related ambition and strategy over time. So again, we're not going to spend a lot of time going into this now, but it's really important that in terms of targets, it's not just the metric and how the metric changes. It's also how that fits into the broader strategy, and it's very important that there are time elements linked to targets. The TCFD recommends targets and metrics that matter being split down into short, medium, and long term. So it's really useful that in order to provide that information for the users of these disclosures. So climate metrics and climate targets both translate into climate-related financial impacts. And of course, they're very closely linked, but there is that slight difference in terms of what you're trying to do with within different measures. So again, key. I mean, the TCFD, even though it's broadly seen as a disclosure framework, it's really more of a strategic management framework. And the intention behind the TCFD is to create information that institutions can use to manage their risk and opportunities going forward. So it's really how the information is used is critical to TCFD disclosure, and it's critical to understanding how far an entity is down the TCFD journey. So metrics, need to play an active role in activities throughout the investment, lending, or insurance decision-making process. So a metric needs to be useful, and it needs to be demonstrated that it's used. So it is useful and used. And then target setting, of course, is a useful tool to track efforts. So in terms of reducing reducing exposure or maximizing opportunities over time. So it is a useful monitoring aspect, but again, it's also a critical signaling aspect. So if an organization is signaling a inefficient or a very small, very unambitious target, well, that tells you something about the expectations of the future, and that's probably something that you need to set up and take notice of. Then again, targets need to be embedded in the governance processes of an organization. There's no point in having the targets unless you're trying to meet them, and unless how far away from these targets you are, unless it influences your decision making, it really is pointless to just have a target for target's sake. And also in terms of, and then obviously the availability and reliability of data is critical in setting climate metrics and targets. So it's no point, there's no point trying to measure a metric which you don't have the data to do that, or to set a target which you don't know whether you're ever going to meet that target. Now, there is a bit of good news on that front, and that is that what we've seen from the TCFD recommends this, but we've also seen this from disclosures already, is that institutions are using qualitative metrics to supplement quantitative data. So if the complete data doesn't exist in order to measure something, you can always use rating scales and things like that in the meantime, in order to measure that, or to signal that you are keeping an eye on these on these metrics, and that you are monitoring them. And then, as I mentioned earlier on, it's particularly in terms of metrics and target, it's very important to not just ever refer to emissions. It's very important to split, scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, and from scope 3 emissions. And again, based on the organization, all of these, all three are probably going to be relevant, but obviously for certain organizations, scope 1 and 2 is more so. If you're looking at a power utility, scope 1 emissions is going to be it. If you're looking at an energy intensive electricity intensive organization, scope 1 and 2 are definitely going to be key, and scope 3 might be less so. But if you look at anything with long supply chains, so for example, retailers is one where I think there's been recently a realization that scope 3 emissions are actually much more important than people thought initially. And then for financial institutions, scope 3 emissions is critical. That's where all the where all the impact sits. So again, this is just to reiterate a quick reminder of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So based on what Seren had presented to you earlier, the fact that you're interested firstly in all of the greenhouse gases, although methane and CO2 are the two most most important ones and most often disclosed, but really you want to have as many CO2 or as many greenhouse gases as possible included in the reporting. And then it's important to to think about scope 1, 2, and 3. Which do you think is important? And this is, and sorry, what I should say is I'm speaking both from the perspective now of a disclosure, so someone putting out a TCFD report, but also a user of TCFD reports, because particularly asset managers are in the very interesting position that it's almost equally important from an asset management perspective. Your role as a disclosure and your role as a user of disclosures is very closely linked, and much more so than most other organizations. So asset managers need to be very good disclosures, and they also need to be very good at using disclosure. So this is an example for of a metric that's also been translated into a target. So this is Barclays Bank. There's an example in their latest TCFD report of their financed emissions. So the emissions linked to their loan portfolio. So again, what's interesting here is they've given a target, and they've given a metric and a target, but they've also given a comparator. So the key thing about both targets and metrics is to understand them within the broader context of the organization and the broader context within risks and opportunities. So this is something Seren is going to tell you a bit more about when he talks about science-based targets in a bit. But it's really, in order for the information to be really useful, you want to convey whether or not the target is it ambitious, is it attainable, and does it make sense? So metrics and targets, if you can provide context to that, or for an organization that's reporting to you can provide context to that, that is really, that then takes it, then it becomes a decision useful metric. If you know whether it's, whether something is, whether it's ambitious, whether it's good, or not. Now, again, as I mentioned, in terms of metrics, how they're disclosed, what they are, it's really, there's an infinite number of different metrics. But the critical decision is, or the critical way to assess whether a metric makes sense is whether or not it feeds into an organization's strategy and risk management processes. So for most metrics, where we've been engaging with companies that's starting off in the TCFD disclosure journey, more often than not, most of this information they already have. So a lot of these things they're already tracking. They might not be tracking them in a climate context, but they are already there. So, and again, a combination of historical and forward-looking metrics can signal organizations both its progress and its intent. So where you are now and also where you're going. I can't reiterate the point about the value of qualitative disclosure of metrics enough, and I'll show you a couple of examples later on. But it is really, particularly at the start of a disclosure journey, it's really important to provide as much context and as much information as possible, and qualitative metrics can be very useful to do that, particularly while the processes are being put in place to generate the quantitative numbers. Now, examples of disclosures, it can be proportion of assets operating, investing, or financing activities that's materially exposed to physical risk. So so again, this could be, you could have a short list, and you can identify high, medium, or low, and you can count the high, medium, or lows, and I'll show you an example of that later on. It can be quantitative in terms of the credit exposure to fossil fuels or high risk investments from a carbon perspective. Or it can be also exactly. I mean, in terms of all those 4 pillars that that Sharon's talked you through, in terms of the governance, metrics in terms of senior management remuneration, for example, what proportion of remuneration is linked to climate targets, what proportion of management have targets like that. It really, there's no end of options to use to communicate this, and also just the amount of expenditure or capital investment deployed to deal with climate risks and opportunities, or towards certain sectors that are seen as as particularly opportunities or risk is also a useful measure. And this is something we see a lot, where organizations are disclosing their renewable energy portfolios, for example. So they would disclose their holdings in fossil fuel companies, and then they'll also disclose their holdings in renewable energy. Over time, this is probably going to become more integrated, but at the beginning, it's still useful information, even if you just give the two numbers. Here's some examples from Liberty Mutual, for example, which shows their total investment in traditional energy, and then their investment in alternative energy sources. Now, again, this is could be code for high carbon or low carbon, but this is typically where organizations start off. Over time, as they become more sophisticated in their reporting, they'll split these categories out more, and it'll be much clearer to show exactly what they're doing. Now, again, in terms of showing the use of qualitative information in order to support quantitative metrics, this is an example of Citi's portfolio and then the areas in which they operate. So firstly, it's very useful because it gives you a split of percentage of exposure. You can immediately see in what sectors that they are invested in. But then they also provide then a qualitative metric in terms of traditional risk and physical risk, a risk rating. So which of these are high, medium, or low risk on both physical and transition risk? And again, as a user of disclosure, you can then go and you can aggregate these numbers and you can try and see, is this risk profile, is this aligned with your appetite? Are you happy to invest in a company with a portfolio like this? Or would you like it to look slightly different? I mean, then there's always the option of engaging with companies to try and get them to align their portfolios to one that you're more comfortable in and more willing to invest in. But again, it's a great example of a combination of quantitative and qualitative data that provides a lot more information that you would have gotten by just doing the quantitative data. So if Citi had gone and said, look, we can't calculate the risk yet, so we're just going to show you exposure. I mean, that's fine. Lots of entities start off like that, but really by just adding those risk categories in there, it's really a much more useful piece of disclosure. And also, you'll see there's trends over time. So you'll see so you can also track movement over time. So this is really a very good way to start the disclosure journey. And of course, ideally you also want to see some information about how they got to those risk ratings. So it's also important to always disclose the methodology and assumptions underlying both metrics and targets. I mean, that's critical, both as obviously as a disclosure, but also as a user of disclosures. And then, as I said, I mean, there's the metrics that are used are almost infinite. So what BlackRock, for example, has done is in terms of, in addition to its general ESG reporting, it's included just a kind of simple tracking mechanism that just shows the number of climate-related voting actions taken, over time. And again, I mean, it shows intent. It shows that they're tracking this. It shows that they realize that what a climate-related voting action is, up front. So even though it doesn't tell you a whole lot about the impact this is having over time, what it is showing you is that there's something that BlackRock is thinking about. It's something that they're improving on, or something that they're tracking, and something that's increasing over time. So you'll see 2018, 2019, very, very peripheral. But then in 2020, there was an enormous jump up from that. So again, depending on what you want to use your disclosure for, I mean, it really is useful to think a little bit about what you're trying to signal to your stakeholders, and that's always the most important step of the journey. Really is deciding on the metrics and deciding on the targets linked to metrics, before you start disclosing. Now, as I mentioned, as I mentioned previously, given that financial institutions are in this the interesting situation where they are both important users but also very important disclosures, there's also additional guidance for asset managers in terms of what they should disclose. And the three or the four most commonly disclosed metrics currently is absolute emissions. So this is the total number of emissions linked to an asset class, an asset, or a portfolio. And the absolute emissions, again, ideally should be scope 1, 2, and 3, but of course, that's something that can be expanded on over time. But it's also useful to provide metrics in terms of intensity numbers. So both economic emissions intensity or physical emissions intensity. So the first, in terms of economic, it'll be emissions per a unit of value. So in this case, it can be tons of CO2 equivalent, equal to a million euros of assets under management or investments or anything like that. But it's also useful in terms of physical examples. So if you want to compare two power portfolios, for example, it's great to have a amount of emissions versus a megawatt hour of electricity provided, or a ton of product developed, or something like that. So again, any kind of, depending on the portfolio that you're looking at, that will influence how you disclose it. But it's still very useful to have physical intensity numbers in order to compare very specific types of operations. And then lastly, currently, really the kind of high water mark is the weighted average carbon intensity of a portfolio. That is, companies are starting more and more to report that. It's not actually as complicated a thing to do as one would think, particularly because it was great. It was mentioned earlier in terms of our introductory discussion. More and more service providers, more and more market data providers are providing dedicated ESG modules, and these dedicated ESG modules, almost all of them have emissions data in there, particularly for the larger listed equities and assets. This information is out there. Also, as was mentioned during the discussion, right up front, this is a problem in the unlisted space and for kind of weird and wonderful assets. But we're hoping, I'm hoping over time that will also become less of an issue. So I'm going to just kind of show you a couple of examples. So something we've seen, particularly in the developed world, so particularly in the kind of US and EU markets and also the UK market, is there's a lot of product level disclosure starting to happen. So this is an example, or an indicative example of a BlackRock product that was in their disclosure, where again they used the data from MSCI to create a weighted average carbon intensity of of this product. So immediately you can see exactly what the carbon intensity of this product is. And you're seeing this more and more, like I said, particularly in the UK where I'm based. This information is starting to pop up in brochures, in terms of retail information. So it's really starting to come to the fore. Interestingly, so in order for this information to be really useful, you need a comparator. And this is, I guess, what BlackRock is also in their TCFD report has illustrated, is really you want the product weighted average carbon intensity, and then you want kind of indexes or something to compare it to. So you want to know, is this better or worse than than an alternative? So it's, again, context is everything. But then, I mean, looking through the information, I guess we're always looking, internationally for best practice. But actually, 91's, well, even last year's TCFD reporting, they've actually done this. So they've calculated the weighted average carbon intensity for their portfolio. So as you'll see what they've done here is that they've given it both scope 1 and 2 and scope 1, 2, or 3. So these are the emissions. These are the scope 1 and 2 and 1, 2, and 3 emissions linked to their investment portfolio. So not the company emissions, but the actual financed emissions. The reason people are still so essentially that for them this is a scope 3 emission. This is their financed emissions. The reason people are still reporting it in this format, so scope 1 and 2 separate from scope 1, 2, and 3, is because at this stage, scope 3 information isn't quite as detailed as scope 1 and 2 information. So in terms of organizations reporting, companies reporting, they more and more are starting to report scope 3 emissions, but it's not the same level of data disclosure as scope 1 and 2 yet. So when you're just as an asset manager calculating your scope 3 financed emissions, you need to decide whether you're going to be including the scope 3 emissions of the entities that you're counting, or the investments that you're counting, also in that number. And then, but then, while currently the weighted average cost of weighted average carbon intensity is best practice, it's suggested by the TCFD. Really, what we're seeing as future best practice, and it's already starting to happen, is a metric called climate value at risk. So it's really calculating the changes in your portfolio you expect under certain scenarios. So both there's really the value of expected value of physical and transition risk under different scenarios. Now, this, of course, is quite complicated to do. So the weighted average carbon intensity is easy to do. The data, particularly for large investments, is easily accessible. The problem with the value at risk is, for that you need dedicated models. You need assumptions that translate those scenarios and the impact of those scenarios into financial impacts. But we're seeing more and more people, are using this, or planning to use this in future. Investec, for example, have signaled that by 2024 they want climate value at risk, that metric to be. They want to start disclosing that metric. So people are moving towards this area. Now, the important thing is, in order to do this, you need scenarios. So in a little while, we'll tell you a bit more about climate scenarios, and that's another thing that currently is holding back the use of climate value at risk. But it's really something to start thinking about if you are an asset manager. Now, just before I hand over to Seren to discuss science-based targets, I wanted to give you a quick bit of information about physical risk. So I guess this is, given the discussion we had at the start of this workshop, I thought it'd be useful to quickly go just give you a couple of examples of how that's being done currently. Now, physical risk up until this point in time has been relatively neglected, largely because, like I said, it was seen as more of a medium to long-term impact. Now, as I popped into the chat earlier on, I think that the IPCC 6 assessment report really has challenged that, that notion. I think what we're starting to understand now is physical climate risks are already here. They're materializing much sooner than we expected. They're materializing much more intensely than we expected. So really, physical risk is, it might not be at the same level, quite at the same level of transition risk yet, but I don't think it's a thing that you start worrying about in 5 to 10 years' time. I think it's a thing you need to start worrying about now. The impacts might only accelerate in 5 to 10 years' time, or become really significant in 5 to 10 years' time. But it's really time to start thinking about this. So BlackRock, for example, even though they don't disclose physical risk metrics in the TCFD report, in 2019 they did a study on physical risk, looking at the expected impact of climate change on municipal areas in the in the US, and again, this information is influencing their decision in terms of the risk profile of municipal debt and other instruments. And this is typical of the kind of analysis you'd see for physical risk, where it's really, you try and aggregate all the impacts into financial impacts. So you're trying to understand what do you think is going to happen, for example, to the kind of burden of of certain municipalities, what's going to happen to the impact on their revenue streams and so on. And then you use this information to decide whether you think certain municipalities are probably more or less risky than their current risk ratings might actually be signaling. And again, in this case, you can see, so the user information, you really want to be trying to focus on the outliers at this stage. You want to see the companies that are, or the municipalities that are exceptionally vulnerable, and this is what they've done. Here in Miami is when they came out at worst in terms of their analysis. But of course, this is just looking at a municipality. You can also be looking at the companies inside a municipality. But this level of analysis does give you areas to focus on. So it does show you where hotspots are. So I mean, a simple way of using this would be to overlay this data on the investment portfolio to try and see which companies that they invested in are within these municipal districts. And that would be another potential use of this going forward. And then last example is just, again, a kind of homegrown example is Investec. So where they've also, and again, it's a nice combination of qualitative and quantitative metrics that they've used here. It's split down by short, medium, and long term. So I'm not going to go into the detail now. You can feel free to kind of look at the Investec Climate Financial Disclosure Report. It'll show you all of that. But they're trying to, in the absence of quantitative indicators of risk, they are giving you a lot of qualitative information about the risks. When do you think the risk is going to happen, and so on. So there, in terms of their critical risk, their short-term risk is risks to their operations, where their office is based, for both acute and chronic risk. So this is the one where they then try to provide some metrics. So what they've done is they've used that publicly available, think hazard tool, and they've used that to kind of to basically count the locations in South Africa and the UK, and then try and see how many of those locations are vulnerable to high, to different, to high or medium risks. And again, they've done this for their locations. This same example, the same exercise could be done looking at where the main production plants for a certain company that you've invested in are, for example. So it's a great first step in order to start doing this kind of analysis. Now, in terms of the targets, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about those. I guess, firstly, the important thing is, again, different types of targets and different types of time horizons. So particularly given the different pillars of the TCFD, I mean, it's good to have kind of long-term, medium, and short-term targets. What's happening more and more is the targets, again, are being set within the broader context of the low-carbon transition. So which is why the particularly science-based targets are becoming so important, because more and more organizations have long-term targets, but for it to be useful, you need some kind of context as to whether or not that target is it challenging? Is it going to be enough? If an organization meets their target, does that put them on a good track to be climate resilient? To still be around in 20 or 30 years' time, or are they still going to be much more carbon intensive than their peers, even if they meet those targets? So that's why it's really important to place the targets within a context of what they're trying to signal. Now, this slide, again, there's just a couple of examples of the kind of metrics that you can use to set targets. Whether it's exposure to Scope 1, Scope 2, or Scope 3 emissions, it could be exposure to using an internal carbon price or a shallow carbon price in order to calculate future exposure, to policies. It can be assets within a certain, a certain area, or assets within a certain asset class, or in terms of physical risk, like I say, whether they are in locations that are subject to physical risk, as the examples we just saw. And really, there is there's an infinite number of targets, that can be set, but in order to set the right target as an organization, it's important to think about how do you manage these risks, and then important to work back from strategy to targets. Targets can be useful to guide strategy, of course, but really, in order to know, how quickly you have to act and how seriously you have to act, it's really important to think of these things together. So targets shouldn't be set outside of strategy, and they should be linked back to strategy.